Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're diving deep into Auguste Comte and this philosophy he termed positivism.
Right. And for a long time, these ideas were kind of niche, mostly talked about by his direct followers.
But they've definitely grown. Now it feels like, well, anyone seriously discussing philosophy or just looking at the big intellectual shifts kind of has to grapple with Comte.
Absolutely. Our source material for this is a really detailed analysis.
Yeah.
It digs into his whole philosophy.
Yeah, covering both the early stuff, which is generally pretty well respected, and then his later ideas, which are, shall we say, a bit more controversial.
That's a polite way to put it, yeah.
So the mission here is really to pull out the key takeaways, understand what positivism actually is, and define Comte's core thinking, even the parts that might seem, well, a little surprising.
Are downright strange sometimes.
Exactly. Think of this as your shortcut, maybe, to getting a handle on a really influential and, yeah, sometimes quite odd philosophical system.
So just hearing positivism and Auguste Comte, what jumps out? Let's dig into this analysis and see what's really going on.
Okay, so the analysis really flags his core contribution right away, this fundamental generalization he made.
Yeah, the law of three stages. He proposed that basically every distinct type of human idea, every concept, goes through these three predictable phases.
Every concept, wow. Not just science?
Nope, everything. The
Yeah.
whole sweep of human understanding across history. That's the claim.
Okay, so phase one, he calls it the theological stage.
That's it, the starting point. Phenomena get explained by attributing them to wills, to personal agents.
Like gods or spirits.
Exactly. Or even earlier, fetishism, where natural objects themselves, the sun, the moon, are seen as divine, worshipped directly.
And that stage progresses internally, too.
Right. From that fetishism to polytheism,
Yeah.
multiple gods running the show, and eventually it culminates in monotheism, a single overarching will.
The analysis suggests thinking of it broadly as the personal or volitional stage.
Yeah, that captures the essence explanations rooted in intention and will.
But the analysis points out, doesn't it, that the jump to monotheism wasn't actually that straightforward or early for humanity.
No, not at all. It argues it was a late, difficult transition, kind of unnatural before a certain point, because, well, look around the world often looks like conflicting forces are at work. That fits multiple gods pretty well.
Right. Chaos, different domains.
Precisely. The analysis even mentions that, even within developed monotheism like Christianity, you still had this thoroughly polytheistic conception of a devil, a counterwill.
Fascinating. So how did the single god idea win out if multiple gods seemed like a better fit initially?
Well, the analysis suggests a key driver was philosophers and thinkers starting to notice the growing practical feeling of regularity, the invariability of natural laws.
People just saw patterns more and more.
Yeah. And it's like easier to imagine one consistent, all-powerful will acting in a fixed way, creating these invariable operations, than it is to make sense of that consistency if you've got a bunch of potentially conflicting gods with their own agendas.
Okay, that makes sense. But even with one god, the belief in totally fixed laws wasn't quite there yet.
Not completely. The theological explanation kind of adapted. You got a single god, sure, but one who was still seen as, flexible by entreaty.
So you could still pray for intervention, miracles.
Exactly. Ordering things by direct volition, performing miraculous interpositions. The idea of absolute, unbreakable natural law hadn't fully taken root in the collective mind yet.
Which sets the stage, then, for stage two, the metaphysical stage.
Right, the transitional phase. Here, explanations shift away from personal wills, from gods, and move towards abstract concepts, essences, virtues, inherent properties in things.
What Bentham called fictitious entities.
Perfect example. The analysis also suggests terms like abstractional or ontological.
And crucially, the analysis says this wasn't a totally new invention, but more of a transformation of the theological stage.
That's a key point. It describes it as a gradual disembodiment of a fetish. Think about abstract words we use: nature, force, life.
Yeah.
The analysis suggests that originally these weren't just labels. They were thought to have a real objective existence. Like there wasn't just individual trees. There was a literal substance tree making them trees.
Ah, so the abstract concept itself was the explanation.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
Instead of a sky god, maybe it's an abstract electrical essence or principle causing lightning.
The analysis mentions Descartes here, pushing towards explanations based on matter and motion, more like physical laws.
It does. Even if his specific explanations were hypothetical, it was a move towards mechanism. And this stage, the analysis notes, is less hostile to the idea of fixed laws than the purely theological one. Well, it's maybe easier to imagine a single initial volition setting up a kind of cosmic machinery that then runs according to its own abstract principles, rather than relying on the constant, unpredictable whims of deities.
Like a chemistry example, talking about affinity between substances.
Exactly. You're observing how things behave. That's a step towards the positive, but you're still explaining it with a metaphysical concept like affinity, as if it's some inherent force within the substance.
And here's where the analysis gets really interesting for today. It says this metaphysical thinking is still around.
Oh, absolutely. Especially in fields like ethics, politics, even philosophy itself. It hasn't gone away.
The example given is people like Herbert Spencer using the inconceivableness of its negative as a test for truth.
Right, which basically means if I can't imagine the opposite of this idea being true, then the idea must be true in reality.
Which sounds like taking something in your own head and making it a universal law.
Precisely. The analysis calls it erecting a mere creation of the mind into a test or norma of external truth. It's a very subtle but persistent metaphysical move. Something to watch out for, you know.
Definitely. Which brings us finally to Comte's ultimate destination, the positive stage.
The final stage, the one he thought was destined to prevail. Here, phenomena are understood only through invariable natural laws. No wills, no gods, no abstract essences interfering.
So knowledge becomes about observation, seeing what happens, how it happens.
Exactly. Describing the sequences and coexistences of phenomena, identifying patterns, the laws governing them, but not asking about ultimate why questions or hidden causes. The analysis suggests terms like phenomenal or experiential, though they have slightly different flavors.
And the analysis stresses Comte didn't invent this positive method. It was already being used in sciences like physics.
That's crucial. His big contribution, his genius, according to the analysis, was the generalization. Seeing that this three-stage pattern applied across all domains of human thought, that grand historical sweep was his unique insight.
So if the positive stage is about understanding through invariable laws, how do you think we should organize knowledge itself?
Well, that led directly to his famous classification or hierarchy of the sciences.
Ordering them logically and historically.
Yes, from the most abstract and general, the simplest, up to the most concrete and complex.
And the order was, let me see, mathematics first.
Math first. Then astronomy, physics, chemistry, biology, and finally the pinnacle for him, sociology, the science of society.
And the analysis notes he later added morals as a seventh, even higher science.
He did. The core idea is dependence. Each science relies on the ones before it, not just for facts, but crucially for its methods. You learn how to investigate scientifically in the simpler domains first.
Can you give some examples of that dependence from the analysis?
Sure. Astronomy obviously needs mathematics, physics needs math, and astronomy, think gravity, celestial mechanics influencing terrestrial physics.
Right.
Chemistry builds on physics. Biology absolutely needs chemistry to understand life processes and all the preceding sciences to sort out what's uniquely biological versus just physical or chemical.
And sociology, the big one.
It rests fundamentally on biology because society is composed of biological humans. You need to understand the laws of human nature to understand social phenomena.
It really does sound like building blocks. But the analysis mentioned some nuances, some exceptions.
Yeah, a couple of interesting points like thermology, the study of heat within physics.
Where does that fit?
Well, its position isn't strictly about being less general than astronomy, say. Heat's pretty universal. But the analysis argues its placement comes from its dependence for scientific constitution. You need the methods developed in astronomy, perhaps, to study heat rigorously, and you definitely need to understand heat before you can properly tackle chemistry and biology.
Okay, so it's about methodological readiness, not just abstractness.
Exactly. And then there's sociology itself. Its method is different, isn't it?
Yes. The analysis points out this fascinating inversion.
Right. Most sciences might go from parts to whole, details to system. But Comte argued that for society, because it's so interconnected, you have to proceed from the whole to the parts.
How does that work?
You have to grasp the overall state of society, its beliefs, its institutions, its arts, its industry. They're all interdependent. Progress isn't isolated tweaks. It's like a single wave moving through the whole system. You need that holistic view first.
Okay, let's dive into sociology a bit more then. The method uses induction and deduction, like other sciences, but the analysis says there's a twist.
A crucial inversion, yeah. In physics, maybe you deduce something from a known law, then test it with an experiment.
Right.
In sociology, it's kind of the other way around. You start with induction from specific experience, the massive, messy data of history, how societies have actually evolved. This suggests potential social laws.
Okay, so history gives you clues.
Clues, hypotheses. Then you use deduction from the known universal laws of human nature, the stuff you get from biology, maybe psychology, although Comte was wary of that, to verify those historical generalizations.
So if a pattern you see in history seems to acquire people acting in ways that contradict basic human nature,
then your interpretation of history is probably wrong, according to Comte in the analysis. Like, if your historical law assumes people are purely rational or completely selfless all the time.
we know that's not true from biology or just observing people.
Exactly. But if the historical trends you identify do align with, or can be explained by, known human nature, if the story of society makes sense given how humans are apersonal, then those patterns gain the status of positive sociological laws.
And this combination, history plus human nature, was his unique approach to making sociology scientific.
Groundbreaking for its time, yes. And the analysis points out some universal elements he saw in all societies that sociology studies.
Like what?
Well, this constant tension. The struggle between the spirit of improvement driven by our social instincts, our intellect wanting to make things better, and the spirit of conservation driven by personal instincts, habit, maybe laziness.
Progress versus status quo.
Basically, yeah. Always in dynamic balance.
Yeah.
He also looked at fundamentals like family life. Though the analysis notes his views on women and marriage get complicated later, and the absolute necessity of cooperation.
Through division of labor and exchange.
Right, which obviously makes society more efficient economically. It links people through mutual need. But the analysis raises a really important question here.
The downsides.
The potential downsides of the very division of labor. Significant moral and intellectual drawbacks.
It's like narrowing people's minds.
Exactly. You get really good at one tiny thing, but you might lose sight of the bigger picture. Your work can feel like just turning a cog, not a meaningful contribution to society. Public spirit can dwindle.
And the analysis says this can even happen to intellectuals.
Yeah, becoming fatally narrowed if you focus only on your tiny specialization without connecting it back. It's a challenge for any complex society, isn't it? Think about it as that intense specialization sometimes feel limiting in your own experience.
Definitely food for thought. Okay, so we've got the foundations. The 3 stages, the science hierarchy, the sociological method. But the analysis is very clear that Comte's later work, well, it takes a sharp turn.
A significant and, according to the analysis, deeply problematic turn. It describes his later writings as a complete mistake, in many ways.
And it links this partly to his practice of, what was it? Hygiene cerebrale.
Cerebral hygiene, brain hygiene. Sounds odd, right?
It does. What did it mean for him?
It meant he deliberately, systematically stopped reading the work of his contemporaries, even newspapers.
He just shut himself off from new input. Why?
He believed he'd already gathered enough data in his earlier years. He thought avoiding new ideas would help him concentrate, think more originally, develop his own system without distraction.
An intellectual echo chamber, basically.
Like, that's one way to see it.
Yeah.
The analysis admits it might work for some lines, but argues that for Comte, it was disastrous. He lost touch with common sense, with other viewpoints, with scientific progress happening outside his own head.
Leading to conclusions that seemed
Ludicrously absurd is the phrase the analysis uses. Just totally out of sync with reality as others saw it.
And one of the big results of this later period was his religion of humanity.
Right. He became convinced society needed a religion for cohesion, for morality. But he wanted one without God, without theology.
So what do you worship if not God?
Humanity itself, the grand etre, the great being, conceived as this continuous entity, past, present, and future humanity, all linked together.
Why worship humanity?
His argument, kind of interesting, was that unlike an all-powerful God, humanity actually needs our help, our service. Yeah. It's a worthy object because we contribute to it. And maybe paradoxically, it could still evoke that feeling of the infinite.
And it wasn't literally everyone included, was it?
No, that's a key detail from the analysis. Only the worthy members of the human race, past and present, make up the great being. The unworthy are just dismissed, ignored.
And you're supposed to overlook the flaws of the worthy ones.
Minimize them in your thoughts, yes. Focus on the good. And the analysis notes, he even included, in a lesser way, animals that help humanity, dogs, oxen, etc.
Okay. The morality of this religion sounds incredibly intense.
Extreme is the word the analysis uses. The ultimate goal is the good of humanity, sure. But Comte insisted it had to be the only motive, the exclusive motive for absolutely everything you do.
Everything.
Everything. He talked about deadening the personal passions, referring all actions back to social feeling. The ideal was summed up in a phrase he used: love ye humanity more than myself, nor myself except for your sake. Total self-abnegation.
Wow. What about just thinking or basic physical needs?
Of thinking, intellectual pursuits had to be strictly subordinated to social feeling, from the heart over the mind. Physical instincts, to be mortified, suppressed beyond just basic health needs as part of this devotion.
The analysis is pretty critical of this.
Very. It calls him a morality-intoxicated man. It argues he makes the same mistake as extreme forms of Calvinism, basically saying anything that isn't an explicit duty to humanity is somehow sinful.
No room for just neutral actions, or things that are good but not strictly required.
Exactly. The analysis argues there has to be that middle ground. Actions can be meritorious, good, without being obligatory duties. And true self-sacrifice, it argues, has to come spontaneously, not from this kind of rigid, enforced demand.
How do economics fit into this later idealized picture?
Well, the analysis notes he saw the competitive market of his day as maybe a practical reality, but definitely not the moral ideal.
So, not supply and demand determining wages.
Ideally, no. A worker's share should depend on what society can provide for their well-being, not just market competition, and work itself should be done in a soldier's spirit. Meaning dedication, service to the collective good, not primarily for personal gain, like a soldier serving their country.
And there was a whole system of rituals, occultists, for this religion.
Oh yes, very detailed. Private worship involved adoration of humanity, often represented by idealized female figures, the loving sex, he called them, seen as embodying compassion and connection.
And prayer.
Two kinds. Commemoration, which was intense visualization of the object of worship, and effusion, spontaneous spoken prayer, maybe using poetry. The analysis dryly notes Comte's apparent lack of acquaintance with humor regarding some of these prescriptions.
He also made a calendar.
The Positivist calendar, yeah. Days dedicated to great benefactors of humanity throughout history. Though, the analysis points out, it's notable for who it leaves out most Protestant reformers, many figures of the French Enlightenment.
Interesting omissions. Okay, let's talk social structure. This later phase gets very specific, and the analysis seems quite alarmed by it.
Deeply concerned, yes. Politically, he wanted to break up existing large nations, France, for instance, into 17 small republics, about the size of Belgium or Portugal. England would lose its dependencies.
Who would govern these small republics?
Temporal, day-to-day government would be in the hands of triumvirates of capitalists, with bankers at the top.
Bankers in charge. And no elections.
No representative system. Power concentrated. The only checks would be the moral authority of the spiritual power and public discussion. His principle was power proportional to responsibility, but capitalists were trustees for humanity, not absolute owners. Surplus profits were supposed to go back into the business or benefit workers.
Okay, so a temporal power and a spiritual power.
Yes, a completely separate but immensely influential spiritual hierarchy, composed of positive philosophers stretching globally, all headed by a single high priest of humanity, the pontiff, based in Paris.
What would these philosophers do?
They'd direct universal education, provide moral guidance, act as the conscience of society. Crucially, they were meant to be separate from money and political power.
But they had influence.
Huge influence. The analysis highlights their power to control the speculative class scientists, thinkers. They could direct all research toward what they deemed socially useful according to positivist doctrine.
Controlling science. That sounds worrying. What about personal life? Marriage?
Rigidly indissoluble marriage. No divorce. The analysis notes one very specific, complex exception related to public disgrace, possibly linked to his own life. But more startlingly, he condemned second marriages after a spouse's death. The ideal was eternal widowhood.
Eternal widowhood. Wow. And for workers, what was their lot?
Ideally, workers would own their own homes. He specified 7 rooms. They'd get free education, free medical care. Even domestic service was to be moralized, maybe done by family members rather than hired help.
The analysis uses some strong language to critique this whole structure.
It does. It calls it a spiritual despotism, even entire subjugation and slavery. The main target is that immense, unchecked power given to the spiritual authority, particularly the single pontiff dictating thought and research for the entire planet.
So, beyond the structure, what other major criticisms does the analysis raise about this later Comte?
Well, a big one is his complete rejection of psychology as a valid science, especially introspection, looking into your own mind.
He thought you could only study the mind through physiology, brain science.
And observing external behavior? Yes. Reducing the mind to biology. The analysis finds this illogical. How could you even interpret external signs of emotion or thought without some reference to internal experience, your own or others?
And a really fundamental shift, according to the analysis, was his attitude towards truth itself.
Yeah, this is described as a major aberration. He seemed to move away from objectivity to this idea match reality, towards subjective utility. Does this idea fit my system? Does it feel right?
Feeling over fact.
The analysis suggests he even allowed feelings of taste to play a role in accepting scientific ideas. He became indifferent to actual proof, believing his own hypotheses, like a whole system of phrenology he just made up, had to be true because they were coherent with his grand vision.
And the analysis claims he developed a real hatred for scientific pursuits. That seems incredibly ironic for the founder of positivism.
It does seem paradoxical, but that's the assessment. He wanted to actively suppress independent intellectual inquiry unless it served immediate, obvious human needs, as he defined them.
So no pure research.
He explicitly condemned things like studying distant stars, idle curiosity, or investigating the physical nature of the sun. If he couldn't see the direct practical payoff for humanity, he wanted it stopped.
But the analysis pushes back hard against that, right? With historical examples.
Very effectively. It asked the crucial question, who on earth can know in advance what knowledge will turn out to be useful?
Right.
It gives great examples. Abstract math on conic sections, seemingly useless, becomes vital for Kepler and astronomy. Trying to solve longitude didn't directly invent the compass, but the underlying science did. Franklin, messing with lightning, leads to the telegraph. Archaeology unearths forgotten history. Pure, undirected curiosity often yields the biggest breakthroughs later on.
A powerful counter-argument to suppressing research. And maybe the weirdest example of his later rigidity was about writing style.
Oh, this is presented as just ludicrously absurd. His attempt to impose arbitrary rules on writing itself.
Like what?
Things like, every paragraph must have exactly 7 sentences. No sentence can exceed a certain length. You should even choose the starting letters of words based on sacred numbers, like 1, 2, 3, 7.
That's bizarre.
The analysis calls it meaningless, fantastic, and oppressive. Just a sign of a mind obsessed with imposing order on everything, losing all connection to practicality or reason, a melancholy aberration.
And there was also positivist fetishism, animating nature.
Yeah, another strange turn. His idea to, personify the laws of nature, even abstract concepts like space, which he called the grand fetish, the great fetish. The analysis basically dismisses this as pitiable niaiseries, sad nonsense, a bizarre return to the very kind of thinking he claimed positivism overcame.
His view of history also shifted in this later phase, became biased.
According to the analysis, yes. He developed a strange fondness for ancient fetishism, seeing it as a religion of love. The analysis argues it was fear-based. He praised ancient theocracies, priestly castes, for providing unity and systematization, overlooking their historical limitations.
Contrasting with his view of the Greeks,
Who he disliked, precisely because they valued intellectual freedom and speculation over rigid social order. It shows where his priorities ended up.
and his changing opinion on Napoleon reflects this too.
The analysis sees it as a sign of moral decline. He came to view Napoleon as a better, more effective dictator than the constitutional monarch Louis Philippe. Napoleon's big mistake, in later Comte's view, simply restoring the Academy of Sciences, an institution dedicated to independent thought.
Prioritizing authoritarian order above all else.
That's the interpretation presented.
So, wrapping this all up, what does it mean? We've gone through this deep dive, guided by the analysis, into Comte's world. It's dense, fascinating.
And quite a journey. We've seen this brilliant mind laying out the law of 3 stages, the hierarchy of science's foundational stuff.
Absolutely. But then, that same mind transforms into the designer of this incredibly rigid, highly eccentric, fully planned society, and this surprising religion of humanity.
It's a stark contrast, isn't it? His early work really pushed forward the philosophy of science, the very idea of a science of society. Hugely influential, even if you disagree with parts.
But the later work, seemingly driven by that self-imposed isolation, that absolute fixation on unity and system, leads down paths the analysis condemns as serious errors. Authoritarian, controlling, sometimes just bizarre.
It really forces you to ask that question the analysis raises. How does this happen? How can a thinker capable of such profound insights end up advocating for ideas that seem so out of touch? even embracing what the analysis calls spiritual despotism.
Was it the hygiene cerebrale, the obsession with system, something else about his personality or experiences?
It's hard to say definitively, but the analysis strongly suggests that isolation and the prioritization of systemic coherence over empirical reality played a huge role.
And while, yeah, most of those later, very specific prescriptions have been rejected, his attempt to systematize knowledge, to understand society scientifically, that legacy persists. Understanding Comte, both sides, helps us trace a major thread in how we've thought about progress, knowledge, and the ideal society.
Definitely. And think about that core tension highlighted throughout the analysis. You start with this rigorous scientific method, grounded in observation, aimed at understanding the world as it is.
Right.
And you end up with a system that wants to rigidly control thought, feeling, research, behavior, all based on what are ultimately subjective ideals about what's good for humanity, even if they're presented as a logical system.
It raises big questions, doesn't it, about the limits of applying scientific models to complex human life, or the potential dangers when the desire for order, for a perfect system, overrides respect for freedom, for messy reality, maybe even for basic common sense.
Exactly. What happens when the system becomes more important than the people it's supposed to serve?
That is definitely something to mull over. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the complex world of Auguste Comte.